Entitled Neighbor claims my private road belongs to their HOA. Police remove them. Ever had that moment when someone tries to claim something that's clearly yours? Well, buckle up, because this story about an entitled neighbor who thought she could claim my private road as HOA property turned into one of the craziest experiences of my life. From false claims to police intervention, this story shows just how far some people will go to control others. Make sure you stay until the end to see how justice was finally served. Before we dive into this wild story, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. You won't want to miss future stories about entitled neighbors, property rights, and standing up for yourself. Drop a comment below if you've ever dealt with an overzealous HOA member. Let me take you back to where it all started. Last spring, I finally achieved my dream of buying my first home, a charming colonial-style house at 247 Maple View Road in the Oakridge Estates neighborhood. The property had everything I wanted: a spacious yard, mature trees, and most importantly, a private road that led to a detached garage and workshop in the back. This private drive had been one of the main selling points, as it gave me easy access to my workshop where I restore classic cars, a hobby I'd been passionate about for years. The previous owner had made sure to emphasize that the road was completely private property, included in the deed and specifically excluded from the Willow Creek HOA's jurisdiction. They'd even provided all the original documentation showing the road predated the development and had been grandfathered in as private property. I made sure my real estate agent double-checked everything, and all the paperwork was crystal clear. This road was mine. End of story. The first few months were exactly what I'd hoped for. My neighbors, Dave and Laura Mitchell, quickly became friendly faces, often stopping by to chat when I was working in the yard. They'd been in the neighborhood for 5 years and gave me the lay of the land. Even Jim Parker, the elderly gentleman across the street, would wave from his porch and occasionally share stories about the neighborhood's history. Life settled into a comfortable routine. I'd leave for work in the morning, wave to the neighbors, and spend my weekends either working on cars in my workshop or tending to the property. The Willow Creek HOA had their usual rules about lawn maintenance and exterior appearances, but I kept everything in compliance and there were no issues. The private road, which I maintained myself, was well kept and never caused any problems. That all changed the day Barbara Reynolds decided to make herself known. I remember it clearly. It was a sunny Saturday morning in late summer. I was in my workshop, doing some maintenance on a '67 Mustang I'd been restoring, when I heard a sharp knock on the workshop door. Opening it, I found myself face to face with a woman in her late 50s, wearing what I'd come to know as her signature look: pressed khakis, a polo shirt, and an expression that suggested she'd just smelled something unpleasant. "You must be Michael," she said, not waiting for me to introduce myself. "I'm Barbara Reynolds, HOA board member. We need to discuss this road situation." I was a bit confused, but remained polite. "Nice to meet you, Barbara. What road situation?" She gestured dismissively at my private drive. "This access road. It's not up to HOA standards, and we've had complaints about the vehicles you're bringing in and out. The board has decided it needs to be brought under HOA jurisdiction for proper management." I felt my stomach tighten a bit, but kept my cool. "There must be some misunderstanding. This is actually a private road. It's part of my property. It's in my deed and specifically excluded from HOA jurisdiction." Barbara's expression hardened. "That's not how things work here at Oakridge Estates. All roads in the development fall under HOA management. We'll need you to sign some paperwork transferring control to the association. It's for the good of the community." I stood my ground, though I made sure to keep my tone respectful. "I appreciate your concern, Barbara, but I have all the documentation showing this is private property. The road predates the development and was specifically exempted in the original HOA agreement. She crossed her arms, her face taking on a look that I'd soon become very familiar with. "Well, we'll just see about that. The board won't be happy about this resistance. You're new here, Michael. You don't want to start off on the wrong foot." With that thinly veiled threat hanging in the air, she turned and walked away, her steps sharp and deliberate on the pavement. I watched her go, already feeling that this wouldn't be the end of it. I had no idea just how right I was. I spent the rest of that afternoon pulling out all my property documentation, making sure I had everything in order. The deed, the property survey, the HOA exemption paperwork, everything was clear as day. I even took photos of all the documents, just in case. Something about Barbara's demeanor told me I'd need to be prepared. That evening, Dave Mitchell came by while I was checking the mail. "Saw Barbara leaving earlier?" he said, shaking his head. "Let me guess. She tried to claim jurisdiction over your private road." I nodded, and Dave sighed. "She's been on the HOA board for 3 years now, and she's been trying to expand their control ever since. Last year, she tried to claim the Parker's garden shed was HOA property because it was visible from the street. Just watch your back, Mike. Document everything." I thanked Dave for the heads up, but I still wasn't too worried. After all, I had all the proper documentation, and this was clearly my property. How bad could it really get? Looking back now, I wish I'd known just how far Barbara Reynolds would go to try to claim control over my private road. But that's just the beginning of this story, and things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. Life continued as normally as it could in Oakridge Estates after that first encounter with Barbara Reynolds. The autumn weather brought perfect conditions for working in my workshop, and I spent most weekends focused on my latest restoration project. The '67 Mustang was coming along nicely, and I'd started getting interest from other classic car enthusiasts in the area. A few even stopped by to check out my progress, always using my private road to access the workshop with my permission. These visits didn't go unnoticed. I often spotted Barbara watching from her kitchen window, phone in hand, presumably, taking photos or making notes. I tried not to let it bother me, instead focusing on maintaining my normal routine. Each morning, I'd head out to work, exchange friendly waves with Dave and Laura Mitchell, and sometimes chat with Jim Parker about his garden plans for the upcoming spring. The neighborhood had its own rhythm. Every Tuesday was garbage day, and you could set your watch by Mrs. Parker's morning walks with her Scottish Terrier. The mail carrier, Tom, would arrive precisely at 2:15 p.m., and the school bus would drop off kids at the corner of Mapleview Road at 3:30. It was exactly the kind of predictable, peaceful suburban life I'd hoped for when I bought the place. I made an effort to be a good neighbor. My lawn was always well maintained, my house paint was within HOA guidelines, and I kept my restoration work confined to reasonable hours. The private road was kept clean and in good repair. I'd even had it professionally sealed before winter set in. Several neighbors commented on how much better it looked than when the previous owner had it. One crisp Saturday morning, I was enjoying coffee on my front porch when Linda Stewart, who I'd learned was Barbara's closest friend on the block, walked by with unusual purpose. She slowed as she passed my house, making a show of examining my private road. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head as she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. "Good morning," I called out, keeping my tone friendly. "Something interesting about the road?" Linda startled slightly, apparently not expecting to be confronted. She quickly composed herself, adopting what I can only describe as a bureaucratic tone. "Just documenting some concerns for the HOA. There are standards to maintain, you know." I set my coffee down and walked over to where she stood. The private road is well maintained, and as you probably know, isn't under HOA jurisdiction. But if you have specific concerns, I'm happy to discuss them. Linda's expression soured. "Barbara was right about you. You clearly don't understand how things work here." This is a community, Mr. Anderson, and we have procedures. I understand community spirit, I replied calmly, but I also understand property rights. This road is private property, documented in my deed and explicitly excluded from HOA oversight. I'm happy to show you the paperwork. We'll see about that, she sniffed, turning on her heel and marching off in the direction of Barbara's house. I watched her go, then noticed Dave Mitchell working in his garage across the street. He'd obviously witnessed the whole exchange and walked over, shaking his head. They're building their case, he said quietly. Barbara and Linda have been doing this for years. They target someone new, try to expand HOA control, then move on to the next thing when it doesn't work. Last spring, it was the Thompson family's backyard playground. Before that, it was the Rodriguez's garden fence. I appreciated Dave's insight, but something felt different this time. The focused attention on my private road seemed more organized, more determined.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
What happened with those other situations? I asked. Dave leaned against my mailbox post. Most people either give in or move out. The Thompsons took down their playground. The Rodriguez family sold their house and left. Barbara usually wins. Through attrition, she just keeps pushing until people get tired of fighting. That afternoon, I decided to take proactive steps. I spent several hours organizing all my property documentation into a clear, chronological file. I made multiple copies and stored them in different locations, including a cloud backup. I also started a detailed log of all interactions regarding the road, including the recent encounter with Linda. As I was finishing up this task, I noticed increased activity around Barbara's house. Several cars I didn't recognize had parked out front, and people were going in and out carrying what looked like papers and folders. Through my home office window, I could see them gathered in her living room, gesturing animatedly. Jim Parker, who was watering his prized rose bushes, caught my attention and walked over. HOA emergency meeting, he said quietly. Barbara's hosting it at her house instead of the community center. That's never a good sign. Can she do that? I asked. Jim shrugged. Technically, no. HOA meetings are supposed to be held in public spaces with proper notice to all residents. But Barbara's gotten creative with the rules since she joined the board. She calls these informal discussions to get around the requirements. That evening, my doorbell rang. It was Richard Cooper, the HOA manager, looking uncomfortable in his official capacity. Mr. Anderson, I've been asked to deliver this notice of compliance review. He handed me a thick envelope. The board has received multiple complaints about unauthorized use of community roads. I took the envelope, but didn't open it immediately. Richard, you and I both know this road is private property. It's in my deed, and the HOA's own documentation specifically excludes it from their jurisdiction. He shifted his weight, not quite meeting my eyes. Yes, well, the board has concerns about the historical documentation. They're requesting a formal review of all property boundaries and access rights. And if I refuse, the notice outlines the potential consequences, he said. Already turning to leave, I'd suggest consulting with a property lawyer. Inside the envelope was a formal-looking document filled with legal jargon and veiled threats. The HOA was claiming that recent community concerns necessitated a review of all property boundaries and access rights within Oakridge Estates. They were demanding I submit my private road for inspection and comply with any necessary adjustments to bring it under HOA management. The document included a deadline. I had 10 days to agree to their demands or face escalating fines and potential legal action. It was signed by Barbara Reynolds as HOA board member and community standards director, a title I was pretty sure she'd just invented. I spent the rest of the evening researching property laws and HOA regulations. The more I read, the more confident I became that they had no legal standing. My property rights were clear, and the HOA's own founding documents explicitly recognized my private road's independent status. Still, I knew this was just the beginning. Barbara Reynolds had shown her hand. She was going to try to use the HOA's authority to force me into compliance, but she had underestimated both my determination and my preparation. I wasn't going to be bullied out of my property rights, no matter how many unofficial meetings she held or notices she sent. As I sat at my kitchen table that night, reviewing the HOA notice and making notes, I spotted movement outside. Through my window, I could see Barbara and Linda walking slowly past my house in the darkness, their phones' flashlights illuminating my private road as they took more photos and made notes. I realized then that this wasn't just about a road or HOA control. It was about power, about someone who couldn't stand the idea that anything in her neighborhood might be outside her authority. Well, if Barbara Reynolds wanted a fight, she was going to get one. I wasn't going to be another name on her list of victories. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start making my own moves. First, a call to a property lawyer to review my documentation. Then a formal complaint about unauthorized HOA meetings and harassment. Barbara might think she had the upper hand, but I was about to show her what happened when someone stood up to her tactics. As I watched the two women disappear into the darkness, I couldn't help but smile slightly. They thought they were building their case, but with every photo and every note, they were actually documenting their own harassment. I made sure my security cameras were recording and added another entry to my log of incidents. The familiar sound of a car engine drew my attention back outside. Through my front window, I watched as more cars pulled away from Barbara's house. The unofficial HOA meeting apparently concluded. In the glow of the streetlights, I could see residents walking back to their homes, some glancing toward my property with obvious curiosity. I noticed Dave Mitchell standing in his driveway watching the procession. When he caught my eye through the window, he gave me a subtle thumbs up. It was good to know I had at least some allies in the neighborhood. I had a feeling I was going to need them. That night, as I prepared for bed, I heard the distinctive sound of a car moving slowly past my house. A quick glance confirmed my suspicion. Barbara's silver sedan creeping along my private road with its headlights off. I added it to my log of incidents, including the date, time, and details. Each small act of harassment was another piece of evidence, another brick in the wall of my defense. I fell asleep that night with a strange mix of emotions: frustration at the harassment, determination to stand my ground, and an odd sense of anticipation. Something told me this situation was going to get worse before it got better, but I was ready for whatever came next. Barbara Reynolds might think she ruled Oakridge Estates, but she was about to learn that some battles aren't worth picking. The next morning would bring new challenges, but for now I could rest knowing I had the law on my side. My private road was exactly that, private, and no amount of HOA overreach was going to change that fact. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what Barbara's next move would be. Little did I know, she was already planning something that would take this conflict to an entirely new level. The crisp morning air carried a hint of tension as I pulled into my workshop driveway early that Wednesday. A group of unfamiliar faces, huddled near my property line, caught my attention. Barbara Reynolds stood at the center, gesturing animatedly while clutching what appeared to be architectural drawings. Her companion, a man in a pressed suit who I'd never seen before, nodded along while scribbling in a leather-bound notebook. My arrival interrupted their discussion. Barbara's expression shifted from authoritative to calculated as she noticed me parking my car. The suited man straightened his tie and approached my workshop with practiced confidence. "Mr. Anderson, "I'm Gregory Walsh, representing the Willow Creek HOA's legal interests," he announced, extending a business card. "We're conducting a preliminary survey of the property boundaries. The board has some concerns about potential encroachment issues." I accepted his card but remained in my doorway. I wasn't notified of any survey today, and as you can see from my property documentation, this is a private road with clearly established boundaries. Walsh's professional smile didn't waver. "Yes, well, that's precisely what we're here to verify. There seems to be some discrepancy between the original development plans and current property usage. Miss Reynolds has brought some concerning irregularities to our attention." Barbara seized the opportunity to interject, stepping forward with her stack of papers. "The original plans from 1985 show this as a community access road. We have documentation right here." She thrust a faded blueprint in my direction. I didn't take the papers. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened my camera app, beginning to record. "I'll need any request for property inspection in writing with proper notice. Also, I'd like to point out that you're currently trespassing on private property." Walsh's smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Anderson, we're simply trying to resolve this amicably. The HOA has a responsibility to ensure all properties within Oakridge Estates conform to community standards and regulations. And I have a responsibility to protect my property rights," I countered. "My deed and property survey clearly show this road as private property, explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction. If you'd like to dispute that, you'll need to do so through proper legal channels." Barbara's face reddened. "This is exactly the kind of uncooperative attitude that disrupts our community standards. We're trying to maintain property values and ensure proper access for all residents. By trespassing and making false claims about my property," I kept my voice steady, continuing to record. "I'll say it one more time. You're on private property without permission. Please leave now." Walsh placed a restraining hand on Barbara's arm as she started to protest further. "We'll be in touch through official channels, Mr. Anderson. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position on this matter." They retreated to the street, Barbara throwing dark looks over her shoulder. As they left, I noticed Linda Stewart emerging from behind a nearby tree, her phone lowering from what had clearly been a recording position. She hurried after Barbara, but not before giving me a smug look that set my teeth on edge. I spent my lunch break calling Mark Wilson, a local surveyor recommended by my real estate agent. He agreed to come out that afternoon to verify my property lines and document the current state of the private road. It wasn't cheap, but I needed professional backup for what was clearly escalating into a serious situation. Mark arrived promptly at 3, his equipment gleaming in the afternoon sun. As he worked, I noticed several neighbors watching from their windows and porches. Barbara and Linda made several passes by foot, phones out, documenting every measurement Mark took. "Your property lines are exactly as shown in your deed," Mark confirmed after 2 hours of careful work. "This road is completely within your property boundaries, and I can verify it predates the HOA establishment. They have no claim here." I paid Mark for his time and an official report, which he promised to have ready the next day. As he packed up his equipment, Barbara approached again, this time with Patricia Wells, the HOA board president, in tow. Patricia's presence was unexpected. She rarely involved herself in neighborhood disputes, preferring to delegate to other board members. Her involvement suggested Barbara had been pushing hard behind the scenes. "Michael," Patricia began, her tone carefully neutral, "I think we need to discuss this situation. The board is very concerned about the precedent being set here." I stood my ground. "I'm happy to discuss anything, Patricia, but it needs to be through proper channels. I've had people trespassing on my property today, making unauthorized surveys and taking photos without permission." Patricia glanced at Barbara, who quickly jumped in. We have every right to document violations of community standards. Your refusal to comply with HOA regulations is affecting everyone's property values. There are no violations to document, I replied calmly. I have a licensed surveyor's confirmation that this is private property, exactly as stated in my deed. Any attempts to claim otherwise could be considered harassment. Patricia's expression tightened. Perhaps we should schedule a formal board meeting to address these concerns. This situation seems to be escalating unnecessarily. I welcome a proper board meeting, I agreed, but it needs to be officially noticed and held in the community center, not in someone's living room. And I'll be bringing my attorney. Barbara's face darkened at the mention of an attorney, but Patricia nodded slowly. I'll have Richard send out the official notice. We'll schedule it for next week. As they walked away, I could hear Barbara's angry whispers to Patricia, something about letting him dictate terms and setting a dangerous precedent. Patricia's responses were too quiet to make out, but her body language suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Barbara's arguments. That evening, I received an email from Richard Cooper with the official notice of the HOA board meeting scheduled for the following Wednesday. The agenda included an item titled Discussion of Community Access Roads and Property Line Verification. At least they were following proper procedures now. I forwarded the notice to James Martinez, a property attorney I'd contacted earlier in the week. He confirmed he could attend and advised me to prepare all my documentation for presentation. They're fishing, he wrote back. They know they don't have a legal claim, but they're hoping to pressure you into voluntary compliance. As I reviewed my files that evening, a knock at my door revealed Dave Mitchell, looking concerned. Thought you should know, he said quietly. Barbara's been going door to door all afternoon. She's telling everyone you're trying to block emergency vehicle access and creating a safety hazard. She's getting people pretty worked up about it. I thanked Dave for the heads up and added this new development to my growing log of harassment incidents. The emergency vehicle access angle was a new twist. Clearly, Barbara was trying to create public pressure by painting me as a safety risk to the community. Later that night, I heard voices outside and looked out to see Barbara leading what appeared to be a fire marshal along my private road, gesturing dramatically and pointing at various spots. I quickly grabbed my phone and headed outside. "Can I help you?" I called out, startling them both. The fire marshal, a steady-looking man in his 50s, turned to face me. "Good evening, sir. I'm Fire Marshal Thompson. We received a complaint about potential access issues for emergency vehicles." "I see," I replied, noting Barbara's satisfied expression. "And was this an official inspection request through proper channels?" The fire marshal glanced at Barbara, then back to me. "Well, no, actually. Ms. Reynolds called with concerns, but this isn't an official inspection." "Then I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave my private property," I stated firmly. "I'm happy to schedule an official inspection at a proper time, but this road is private property and you're currently trespassing." The fire marshal nodded, seeming to understand the situation. "My apologies, sir. We'll need to schedule a proper inspection if there are genuine concerns." He turned to leave, adding quietly as he passed, "Though I can see the road is plenty wide enough for our vehicles." Barbara stood her ground for a moment, fuming. "This is exactly the kind of uncooperative behavior I was telling you about. He's putting the whole neighborhood at risk." "Ms. Reynolds," I said evenly, "you've now brought unauthorized people onto my private property twice today. If this harassment continues, I'll be forced to take legal action." She stormed off without responding, but I could hear her on her phone before she'd even reached the street. "Linda, you won't believe what just happened. We need to call an emergency meeting." I went back inside and added this latest incident to my log. The fire marshal angle was clever. I had to give Barbara credit for creativity in her attempts to pressure me. but she'd also given me more evidence of harassment and unauthorized access to my property. As I prepared for bed that night, my security cameras caught Barbara and Linda making another late-night pass by my property, this time with several other neighbors in tow. They were pointing and taking photos, probably trying to document something they could use at next week's board meeting. I smiled slightly as I watched them on my security feed. They didn't realize it, but every photo, every trespassing incident, every attempt to create drama was just strengthening my position. Barbara thought she was building a case against me, but she was actually building my case against her. My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney. Got the fire marshal incident report. Classic harassment tactic. Keep documenting everything. They're digging themselves deeper with every move. I settled into bed, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Barbara Reynolds clearly wasn't done with her campaign to claim my private road, but she was running out of legal options. I had a feeling she was about to try something more dramatic, and I needed to be ready when she did. The morning of the official HOA board meeting arrived with an unexpected surprise. As I stepped out onto my front porch with my morning coffee, I discovered bright orange, no parking, fire lane signs had been staked along my private road during the night. The signs looked official at first glance, but closer inspection revealed they were cheap replicas ordered online, not actual municipal signage. My security cameras had caught the whole thing. The footage showed Barbara Reynolds and Linda Stewart placing the signs at midnight, accompanied by two other neighbors I recognized from their unofficial meetings. They had worked quickly, glancing around furtively as they hammered the stakes. Into my lawn, I was photographing the signs for documentation when Dave Mitchell walked over, shaking his head. "They really went all out this time," he remarked, examining one of the signs. "Barbara was up early this morning, taking pictures and showing them to anyone who would listen. She's telling everyone the fire marshal ordered these installed." Just then, Patricia Wells, the HOA board president, pulled up in her silver SUV. She stepped out, surveying the signs with a frown. "Mr. Anderson, did you install these signs?" "No, Patricia. My security cameras caught Barbara Reynolds and several others putting them up without permission last night. Would you like to see the footage?" Her frown deepened. "That won't be necessary. This is exactly the kind of escalation I was hoping to avoid." She pulled out her phone and made a call. "Richard, yes, I'm at Mr. Anderson's property. Please note that any signs installed along his private road were not authorized by the board. We'll need to address this at tonight's meeting." As Patricia drove away, I noticed increased activity around Barbara's house. Cars were pulling up and small groups of neighbors were gathering on her lawn. Through my workshop window, I could see them gesturing toward my property and examining papers Barbara was distributing. Mark Wilson, the surveyor, arrived around 10 to deliver his official report. His findings were conclusive. My private road was exactly where it should be, completely within my property lines and explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction in all historical documentation. He'd even uncovered additional records showing the road had been privately maintained since before the development existed. As Mark walked me through his findings, Barbara emerged from her house with Gregory Walsh, the HOA's lawyer. They stood at the edge of my property, watching us intently. Walsh appeared to be taking notes while Barbara talked rapidly, pointing at various spots along the road. I decided to take the offensive. "Mr. Walsh," I called out, "since you're here, would you like a copy of the official survey results? It clearly shows this is private property." Walsh seemed caught off guard but maintained his professional demeanor. "That won't be necessary. We'll be presenting our own findings at tonight's meeting." "Findings that contradict the official property records and historical documentation?" I pressed. "I'm curious about that, especially since my attorney will be attending the meeting." Barbara's face reddened. "Your attitude is exactly why we Need stronger HOA oversight. You can't just do whatever you want in this community. Actually, on my private property I can, within the law and my deed restrictions, I replied calmly. Speaking of which, those unauthorized signs you installed last night need to be removed immediately. Those signs are for community safety, Barbara snapped. The fire marshal himself said we need clear access. That's interesting, I responded, because I have an email from the fire marshal's office stating no such requirement exists and no official signs were authorized. Would you like me to forward that to the board? Walsh placed a restraining hand on Barbara's arm as she started to respond. They retreated to her house, but not before Barbara shot me a look of pure venom. Through the window, I could see her, gathering with Linda and several other neighbors, gesturing angrily. The afternoon brought more activity. A steady stream of cars drove slowly past my house, their occupants taking photos and notes. Barbara had clearly rallied her supporters for a show of force before the meeting. Some neighbors I barely knew were walking past repeatedly, phones out, documenting everything from my parked cars to the width of the road. Around 4 o'clock, my attorney James Martinez arrived early to review our documentation before the meeting. As we sat in my kitchen going through the files, we heard a commotion outside. Looking out, we saw Barbara leading a group of about 10 neighbors in what appeared to be an impromptu inspection of my private road. "This is perfect," James remarked, pulling out his phone to record. "They're documenting their own harassment. Every unauthorized entry onto your property strengthens our position." The group scattered when they noticed us watching, but Barbara stood her ground. "We have every right to document safety violations. This road belongs to the community." "Ms. Reynolds," James called out, "I'm Mr. Anderson's attorney. Please be advised that you're trespassing on private property. Any further unauthorized entry will result in legal action." Barbara's response was to pull out her phone and start recording us. "See, he's threatening us for protecting our community. This is exactly what we're talking about." "No one's threatening anyone," James replied calmly, still recording. "We're simply asserting Mr. Anderson's legal property rights, rights that are clearly documented and legally binding." The standoff continued for several minutes, with Barbara narrating dramatically for her phone, while James calmly recorded her trespassing. Finally, Linda tugged at Barbara's sleeve. "The meeting's in an hour. We should go prepare." As they walked away, James turned to me with a slight smile. "They've got nothing. This is all theater for the board meeting. They're hoping to create enough drama that the board will feel pressured to act, regardless of the legal reality." The community center was packed when we arrived for the 7 o'clock meeting. Barbara had clearly been busy. Nearly every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. Many faces I didn't recognize, suggesting she'd rallied people from other parts of the development to pad the attendance. Richard Cooper, looking uncomfortable, was setting up the meeting materials while Patricia Wells spoke quietly with Gregory. "Walsh." Barbara sat in the front row, surrounded by her core group of supporters, all clutching folders full of papers. James and I found seats near the middle, and I noticed Dave and Laura Mitchell sliding into chairs nearby. A small show of support I appreciated. The room hummed with whispered conversations, many people glancing in my direction. Patricia called the meeting to order precisely at 7. "Thanks to everyone for coming. We're here to discuss concerns raised about private road access and community safety in Oakridge Estates. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a formal board meeting. We'll follow proper procedures and everyone will have a chance to speak." Barbara's hand shot up immediately, but Patricia continued. "First, we'll hear from the board's counsel regarding the legal status of the road in question. Mr. Walsh?" "D." Walsh cleared his throat and stood. After reviewing the documentation, including historical records and the original development plans, it's clear that the road on Mr. Anderson's property was designated as private and specifically excluded from HOA jurisdiction. While the board can enforce general community standards regarding appearance and maintenance, they cannot claim ownership or control of the road itself. A murmur ran through the crowd. Barbara jumped to her feet. "That's not what you said earlier. What about the safety concerns, the emergency access issues?" "Ms. Reynolds, please wait to be recognized," Patricia interjected. "Mr. Walsh, please continue." "Regarding safety concerns," Walsh went on, "we've received confirmation from the fire marshal's office that the road meets all required access standards. They've noted no safety issues requiring HOA intervention." Barbara was practically vibrating with tension. When Patricia finally acknowledged her, she launched into a prepared speech about community standards and property values, waving photos of my workshop and classic cars. "This is about more than just a road. He's running a business from his home. There are strange cars coming and going at all hours." "That's not accurate," I responded when Patricia nodded to me. "I pursue my hobby of classic car restoration on my private property, within all deed restrictions and local ordinances. As for access, I maintain the road at my own expense and have never blocked emergency vehicles or created any safety hazard." James then presented our documentation, the property survey, historical records, and Mark Wilson's recent report. He also shared photos of the unauthorized signs and video clips of Barbara's group trespassing on my property. The mood in the room began to shift. Several people who had seemed supportive of Barbara earlier were now whispering and shaking their heads. Patricia called a brief recess to review all the documentation with the board members. When the meeting resumed, Patricia's expression was firm. "Based on the evidence presented, the board finds no basis for claiming HOA jurisdiction over Mr. Anderson's private road. All unauthorized signs must be removed immediately, and any further harassment or trespassing will result in board action against the responsible parties." Barbara exploded from her seat. "This is outrageous! You're letting him destroy our community. I demand a full vote of all homeowners." "Ms. Reynolds!" Patricia's voice cut through Barbara's protests. "The board's decision is final. This matter is closed." The meeting devolved into chaos as Barbara's supporters began shouting and waving their papers. James leaned over to me. "This couldn't have gone better for us. They've completely undermined their own position." As people began filing out, I noticed Barbara huddled with her core group, their expressions dark. Something told me this wasn't over. Barbara Reynolds wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. I was right. What she did next would take this conflict to a whole new level, proving that some people will go to extraordinary lengths when they think their power is being threatened. Dawn broke over Oakridge Estates with an unsettling calm. The orange signs that had littered my private road still stood like garish sentinels, despite the HOA board's order for their removal. As I sipped my morning coffee, a moving truck rumbled down the street, followed by Barbara Reynolds' silver sedan crawling at a suspiciously slow pace. The truck stopped at the entrance to my private road, its diesel engine idling roughly. Two men in coveralls emerged, consulting a clipboard while Barbara approached them, gesturing emphatically toward my property. My security cameras picked up her voice clearly through the morning air. "Yes, right here. Block the entire entrance. We have authorization." I immediately called James Martinez, my attorney, then grabbed my phone to record as I walked outside. The movers had begun unloading heavy wooden barriers, the type used at construction sites to redirect traffic. "Ms. Reynolds," I called out firmly, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" Barbara turned with an exaggerated start, as if surprised, to find me on my own property. "Oh, good morning, Michael. The Community Safety Committee has determined this road needs to be closed pending a full safety inspection. We're just following protocols." "There is no Community Safety Committee," I responded, continuing to record, "and you have no authority to block access to my private property." The movers paused, looking uncertain. One of them pulled out a work order, squinting at it. "Ma'am, you said this was authorized by the property manager?" "It is," Barbara insisted, pulling out a document with what appeared to be the HOA letterhead. "I have the paperwork right here." I stepped closer, my phone still recording. "That document is fraudulent. This is private property, and any attempt to block access is illegal. I've already contacted my attorney, and he's on his way." The movers exchanged glances. The older one shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am, but we can't get involved in a property dispute. We'll need verified authorization from the actual property owner." Barbara's face flushed deep red. "I am the authorization. The Community Safety Committee has jurisdiction over all roads in Oakridge Estates." "The HOA board ruled otherwise last night," I pointed out calmly. "And again, there is no Community Safety Committee. You're attempting to block access to private property under false pretenses." The movers began loading the barriers back onto their truck. Barbara turned on them, her voice rising to a shriek. "Don't you dare leave! I'm paying you to do a job." "Sorry, ma'am," the older mover replied. "We don't want any part of this. You'll need to take it up with our office." They climbed back into their truck, leaving Barbara standing in the street, clutching her fraudulent paperwork. Linda Stewart emerged from her house, hurrying over with her phone already recording. "Don't worry, Barbara. I'm documenting everything. He can't keep blocking community access like this." James Martinez arrived just then, parking behind the departing moving truck. He approached with his briefcase in hand, already pulling out documents. "Ms. Reynolds, I see you're escalating to criminal behavior now, attempting to block access to private property under false pretenses using fraudulent documents. That's several serious offenses. These are official HOA documents." Barbara thrust the papers toward him. "The Community Safety Committee has full authority." James barely glanced at them. "Ms. Reynolds, forging HOA letterhead and creating a fictional committee to justify your actions only makes this worse. I strongly suggest you leave the property immediately." Linda stepped forward, still recording. "We have every right to protect our community. You can't just let him monopolize access to a public road." "It's not a public road," James replied, patiently. "That was established conclusively at last night's board meeting. Now, I'm calling the police to report this attempted blockade and the use of fraudulent documents. I suggest you both leave before they arrive." Barbara's composure cracked. "You think you've won? This isn't over. The community won't stand for this kind of obstruction." She stormed off toward her house, Linda hurrying after her while still trying to film over her shoulder. As James called the police, I noticed increased activity in the neighborhood. Cars were slowing as they passed, neighbors were emerging onto their porches, and phones were appearing everywhere to record the scene. Barbara's attempt to blockade my road had drawn quite an audience. Patricia Wells pulled up in her SUV, looking deeply annoyed. She'd clearly been notified about the morning's events. "Mr. Anderson, I apologize for this continued harassment. The board specifically addressed this last night." "No need to apologize, Patricia," I replied. "But you should know that Ms. Reynolds attempted to block my road using fraudulent HOA documents." Patricia's expression hardened. "Do you have copies of these documents?" "The police are on their way," James interjected. "They'll want to see them as evidence of attempted fraud." 2 patrol cars arrived within minutes. Officer Thompson, who had dealt with previous incidents, took statements while his partner photographed the scene. Barbara refused to come out of her house, but Linda was more than happy to provide her version of events, still insisting there was a community safety committee with full authority over all roads. "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said wearily, "the HOA board president is right here telling us no such committee exists. Are you suggesting she's mistaken about her own organization?" Linda faltered, looking to Patricia for support and finding none. "Well, Barbara said she had proper authorization. She showed us the documents." The fraudulent documents, James corrected, which we'll be adding to our growing file of evidence. As the police completed their report, more neighbors gathered to watch. Dave and Laura Mitchell appeared with coffee and breakfast sandwiches, quietly offering support. "Barbara's been calling everyone in the neighborhood since dawn," Dave muttered, "trying to organize some kind of protest about community safety." Sure enough, cars began arriving from other parts of the development. People I'd never seen before were parking along the street, many carrying hastily made signs about road safety and community access. Barbara had apparently been busy rallying reinforcements. James surveyed the growing crowd with professional interest. She's desperate now. The legal route failed. The HOA board ruled against her, so she's trying to create public pressure. Classic escalation pattern when someone's used to getting their way through intimidation. A news van pulled up, likely called by Barbara or Linda. A young reporter emerged with a cameraman already scanning the scene for the best angle. Barbara suddenly reappeared, freshly made up and clutching a new stack of papers. "Perfect timing," she called out, hurrying toward the reporter. "We're trying to protect our community from someone who's blocking emergency access and endangering everyone's safety." The reporter looked uncertain, especially when James smoothly intervened. "Actually, this is a simple case of harassment and attempted fraud. We have documentation of everything, including this morning's attempt to illegally blockade private property using forged documents." The story quickly shifted focus as Patricia confirmed there was no community safety committee, and the HOA board had already ruled on the matter. The reporter seemed far more interested in Barbara's fraudulent documents and escalating harassment than her claims about community safety. Barbara's supporters began to drift away as the narrative crumbled. The protest signs disappeared. Cars pulled away and the crowd thinned. Even Linda stopped recording and retreated to her house, leaving Barbara alone to face the increasingly skeptical reporter. Officer Thompson approached me with his final report. "We're documenting the attempted blockade and the fraudulent documents. You'll want to keep copies for your records and restraining order application." "Restraining order?" Barbara had overheard. She spun away from the reporter, her voice rising. "You can't do that. I have every right to protect this community." "Ms. Reynolds," Officer Thompson replied firmly, "you've escalated from harassment to attempting to block private property access using forged documents. That crosses several legal lines. I strongly suggest you consult an attorney." The news van packed up and left, the reporter having gotten a very different story than Barbara had likely promised. The remaining onlookers dispersed, leaving Barbara standing alone in the street, clutching her stack of fraudulent papers. James touched my arm. "This is a significant escalation. She's moved from harassment to fraud and attempted property damage. We need to file for that restraining order immediately." As we walked back to my house to prepare the paperwork, I noticed Barbara and Linda huddled on Barbara's porch, heads close together in intense discussion. Something in their manner suggested this morning's failure wouldn't be their last attempt. Patricia approached before leaving, her expression grave. "The board will be holding an emergency session this afternoon to discuss Ms. Reynolds' actions. This has gone far beyond a simple property dispute. I spent the rest of the morning with James, documenting everything for the restraining order application. Through my window, I could see cars continuing to arrive at Barbara's house. She was clearly planning something else. The question was, what would someone who'd already escalated to fraud and attempted property blockade do next? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would shock even those who thought they'd seen the worst of Barbara Reynolds' behavior. A series of rapid knocks on my front door interrupted the quiet afternoon. Opening it revealed Richard Cooper, the HOA manager, looking more distressed than usual. His tie was askew, and he clutched a thick manila envelope in trembling hands. "Mr. Anderson, we have a situation," he blurted, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Barbara Reynolds has filed multiple complaints with the City Planning Commission. She's claiming your property boundaries were improperly recorded and that your road actually sits on land designated for public use." I invited Richard inside, noting Barbara's silver sedan creeping past my house for the third time that hour. In my kitchen, Richard spread out a collection of documents, most bearing official-looking stamps and seals. "She somehow got hold of old township maps from the 1960s, Richard explained, pointing to faded property lines. "She's arguing that when the development was built, this road was meant to be a public thoroughfare. She's filed appeals with every municipal office she could find." The implications were clear. Barbara had escalated beyond the HOA, taking her crusade to city authorities. While her claims were baseless, dealing with multiple bureaucratic challenges would be time-consuming and potentially expensive. My phone buzzed with a text from James Martinez. "Planning Commission just called. Heading there now. Don't engage with anyone until I arrive." Through my kitchen window, I spotted Linda Stewart setting up what appeared to be a video camera on a tripod in her front yard, aimed directly at my private road. Several unfamiliar cars had parked along the street, their occupants gathering in small groups with clipboards and measuring tools. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "There's more. Barbara's convinced several members of the Oakridge Community Council to call for a special hearing about road access. She's telling everyone this is a public safety crisis that requires immediate municipal intervention." A knock at my back door revealed Dave Mitchell, looking concerned. "Thought you should know. Barbara's hired a private investigator. He's been asking neighbors about your workshop activities, trying to build a case about unauthorized business operations." The afternoon unfolded like a carefully orchestrated performance. Every half hour brought new observers, more documentation, attempts, and increasingly creative interpretations of local ordinances. Barbara had clearly been planning this multi-pronged attack for days. Around 3 o'clock, a city utilities truck pulled up. 2 workers in official uniforms approached my private road with surveying equipment. I stepped outside, phone recording. "Afternoon," one worker called out. "We're here to mark underground utilities for the planned road maintenance." "What planned maintenance?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. The worker consulted his clipboard. "We have a work order submitted by the Oakridge Community Council for repaving and widening of this public access road." "This is a private road," I corrected. "Any work order for maintenance would need to come from me, the property owner." The workers exchanged glances. "Ma'am over there said she's the community representative." He gestured toward Barbara, who stood watching from her driveway. "Said this was approved by the City Planning Commission." James Martinez arrived just then, his timing impeccable as usual. "Gentlemen, I'm Mr. Anderson's attorney. I've just come from the Planning Commission office. No such approval exists, and any work order for this private property is fraudulent." The utilities workers quickly packed up their equipment, but not before Barbara stormed over, waving more papers. "This is a public access road. I have documentation right here." "Ms. Reynolds," James interrupted smoothly, "falsifying work orders for city utilities is a serious offense. Would you like to explain these fraudulent documents to the police?" Barbara retreated, but her expression suggested she was far from finished. Throughout the afternoon, more city vehicles arrived, each dispatched based on false work orders or complaints. Each time, James calmly explained the situation while documenting Barbara's escalating fraud attempts. Patricia Wells arrived around 4. Having been alerted to the situation, she looked exhausted. "The board just finished an emergency session. Barbara has been removed from all HOA committees effective immediately. We're also considering further action regarding her board membership." A process server appeared at Barbara's door, delivering notice of the restraining order hearing. Through my security cameras, I watched her reaction. Rather than showing concern, she seemed almost triumphant, immediately pulling out her phone to make calls. As evening approached, the street took on a carnival atmosphere. Barbara had somehow convinced several local activists that this was a public access issue, and they arrived with signs protesting private property overreach. Linda Stewart coordinated with them, positioning people for maximum visual impact for her ongoing video documentation. James stayed late, helping me document each new development. "She's getting desperate," he observed. "Each fraudulent complaint, every false work order just builds our case stronger, but be careful. This level of escalation suggests she's not thinking rationally anymore." Around sunset, a new group arrived. Several official-looking individuals in business attire. They gathered on Barbara's front lawn for what appeared to be an impromptu press conference. Linda's camera was rolling as Barbara addressed them, gesturing dramatically toward my property. Through my security system's audio, I could hear her speech. "This is about more than just a road. This is about community rights, about public safety, about standing up to private interests that threaten our neighborhood's character." The small crowd of activists cheered, but the official-looking visitors seemed less impressed, especially when James approached with copies of the HOA board's decision and property documentation. Several of them left quickly, looking annoyed at having been misled about the situation. As night fell, Barbara's supporters gradually dispersed, but she remained on her front porch, illuminated by security lights, still making calls and taking notes. Linda's camera continued recording, now equipped with a night vision attachment. Dave Mitchell stopped by one last time before heading home. Word is, she's planning something big for tomorrow, some kind of community action event. She's been calling everyone in the development, trying to rally support. I spent the evening reviewing security footage and updating my incident log. Barbara's escalation to city authorities and fraudulent work orders represented a significant shift in tactics. She was no longer just trying to pressure me through the HOA. She was now attempting to create a false narrative of public interest to force municipal intervention. Around midnight, movement on my security cameras caught my attention. Barbara and Linda were making their usual late-night documentation round, but this time they were accompanied by someone taking detailed measurements of my private road and workshop area. Even in the dark, they continued their campaign of harassment and preparation. James sent a final text before turning in. "Court date set for restraining order hearing. Keep documenting everything. Based on today's escalation, we may need to pursue additional legal action." As I prepared for bed, I could still see Barbara's porch light on, her silhouette visible through her front window as she continued her planning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, all I could do was ensure my security cameras were running and wait to see what new scheme she would attempt. The next morning would reveal the full scope of Barbara's plans and show just how far she was willing to go in her crusade to claim control over my private road. Her next move would cross lines that even her strongest supporters couldn't defend, leading to consequences she never anticipated. Sunrise revealed an extraordinary sight outside my window. Barbara Reynolds had orchestrated what appeared to be a full-scale protest. At least 30 people milled around the entrance to my private road, carrying professionally printed signs with slogans like "Public Access Now" and "Safety over Property Rights." A local news van was already setting up, their camera focused on the gathering crowd. My phone rang. James Martinez calling with urgent news. "Don't react to anything you see out there." Barbara's group filed an emergency injunction with the city at 8 a.m. sharp. "I'm heading to the courthouse now to address it." Through my security cameras, I watched as Barbara worked the crowd like a seasoned politician. She'd somehow acquired a portable microphone and speaker system, and her voice carried clearly across my property. This brave group of concerned citizens has gathered to protect our community's rights. We won't let private interests endanger public safety. Linda Stewart managed her usual recording duties while simultaneously coordinating with the news crew. She'd arranged protesters in neat rows for maximum visual impact, positioning children with safety-themed signs prominently in front. A sharp knock at my back door revealed Dave Mitchell, sneaking through my backyard to avoid the crowd. "Most of these people aren't even from our neighborhood," he reported. "Barbara's been recruiting from other HOA communities, telling them this is some kind of test case for private property overreach." More vehicles arrived, a mix of curious onlookers and what appeared to be local activists Barbara had somehow convinced to join her cause. The crowd swelled to nearly 50 people, spilling onto my neighbors' lawns. Several carried measuring tapes and clipboards, making a show of documenting road width and access points. Patricia Wells pulled up in her SUV, looking shell-shocked. At the scene, she made her way through the crowd to my front door. "This is completely unauthorized," she stated flatly. "The HOA board has already ruled on this matter. Barbara's actions now constitute direct defiance of board decisions." The situation escalated when a group of protesters began setting up folding chairs directly on my private road, creating what they called a safety observation post. Barbara directed their placement with obvious satisfaction, making sure the news cameras caught every moment. Officer Thompson arrived, summoned by multiple calls about the gathering. He surveyed the scene with practiced neutrality. "Ms. Reynolds, you need to move these people off private property." Barbara brandished a stack of papers. "We have filed for an emergency injunction. This road is under dispute and we have the right to monitor safety violations." "No court has granted that injunction," Officer Thompson replied calmly. "Until then, this remains private property. Anyone refusing to leave will be cited for trespassing." The crowd's enthusiasm wavered, but Barbara wasn't finished. She produced what appeared to be official city permits, waving them triumphantly. "We have authorization for a public safety demonstration. These are properly filed permits." James Martinez arrived just then, moving quickly through the crowd. "Those permits were obtained fraudulently, Ms. Reynolds. The city clerk's office has already revoked them upon learning the true situation." Barbara's face reddened, but she grabbed her microphone again. "See how they try to silence concerned citizens. This is about our rights as a community." The news crew, sensing the shifting narrative, began interviewing other neighbors. Jim Parker, speaking from his front porch, provided unwelcome context. "That road's been private property since before the development existed. This whole thing is just harassment because someone can't handle not being in control." More police cruisers arrived as the crowd continued to grow. Barbara had apparently been promoting this community action on social media, drawing curious onlookers and self-styled property rights activists from across the city. A city code enforcement vehicle pulled up, responding to multiple complaints Barbara had filed that morning. The inspector, a weary-looking man in his 50s, took one look at his paperwork and sighed. These complaints appear to be duplicates of ones already dismissed as unfounded. Barbara wasn't deterred. She directed her protesters to form a human chain across my private road, linking arms while chanting about community rights. Linda recorded everything, making sure to capture dramatic angles of the confrontation. James huddled with Officer Thompson, while Patricia Wells called an emergency HOA board meeting by phone. The situation had evolved beyond a simple property dispute into something more dangerous. Suddenly, a loud engine roar cut through the chaos. A large concrete truck lumbered down the street, turning toward my private road. Barbara's face lit up with triumph as she rushed to direct it. "Stop that truck!" James shouted, already pulling out his phone. "There's no valid permit for any concrete work here." Officer Thompson moved quickly to intercept the truck while James contacted the concrete company. The driver, looking confused, produced a work order, another fraudulent document with Barbara's signature. "Ms. Reynolds," Officer Thompson's voice carried a new edge of authority. "Falsifying commercial work orders is a criminal offense. Step away from the truck and end this demonstration now." The crowd began to disperse as reality set in. The news crew, sensing the story had shifted from civil rights protest to criminal fraud, focused their cameras on Barbara's increasingly erratic behavior. She grabbed her microphone again, voice rising to a fever pitch. "Don't you see what's happening? They're conspiring to obstruct justice. This is about our community's rights." Linda Stewart, perhaps sensing the shifting tide, quietly packed up her camera equipment and retreated to her house. Several other key supporters followed suit, leaving Barbara increasingly isolated in front of the news cameras. James approached me quietly. The emergency injunction was denied. The judge took one look at her fraudulent documents and dismissed it. "We're filing for additional legal sanctions based on today's events." The concrete truck departed, leaving Barbara standing in the street, still clutching her stack of fraudulent permits and work orders. The remaining protesters, realizing they'd been misled about the situation, began to leave. Patricia Wells approached Barbara, her expression grave. "The board has voted. Your HOA membership privileges are suspended, pending a formal review. This has gone far beyond acceptable behavior." Barbara's response was unexpected. She rushed to her garage and emerged with a stack of traffic cones and yellow caution tape. Before anyone could react, she began attempting to cordon off my private road, screaming about safety violations and community rights. Officer Thompson had seen enough. "Ms. Reynolds, this is your final warning. Remove yourself from private property immediately or face arrest." She ignored him, continuing to string caution tape across my road while shouting into her microphone about conspiracy and corruption. The few remaining protesters watched in uncomfortable silence as their leader unraveled before their eyes. The situation had clearly escalated beyond simple property rights or HOA disputes. Barbara Reynolds, faced with the failure of her community action plan, was now openly defying police orders while committing multiple criminal offenses. What happened next would shock even those who thought they'd seen the worst of her behavior, leading to consequences that would permanently change the dynamics of Oakridge Estates. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my private road as Officer Thompson approached Barbara Reynolds with practiced caution. Her fingers twisted yellow, caution tape as she paced, still muttering into her microphone about community rights and safety violations. The remaining news crew captured every moment of her defiance. "Ms. Reynolds," Officer Thompson's voice carried quiet authority, "you need to remove this tape and leave the property immediately." Barbara spun toward him, her carefully maintained facade cracking. "You're all part of this. The corruption goes deeper than anyone realizes." She fumbled with her phone, frantically dialing numbers. "I'm calling the mayor's office. The governor. Someone has to stop this conspiracy." From my security cameras, I watched Linda Stewart peek out her front door, then quickly retreat inside as she witnessed her friend's mounting hysteria. The few lingering protesters shifted uncomfortably, no longer certain they were supporting the righteous cause Barbara had promised. A sleek black sedan pulled up, and Gregory Walsh, the HOA's attorney, emerged looking grave. He conferred briefly with James Martinez before approaching Barbara. "Ms. Reynolds, I've been instructed to inform you that your actions today constitute multiple violations of HOA bylaws and state law. The board is initiating immediate proceedings for your removal." Barbara's laugh held a manic edge. "Removal? You can't remove me. I am this community. I've protected it for years, while everyone else just sat back and let things fall apart." She wrapped caution tape around her hands like yellow boxing wraps, moving to stand directly in the center of my private road. James Martinez quietly directed, My security cameras to record every moment. Document everything, he murmured. This has moved beyond civil disputes into potential criminal charges. Suddenly, Barbara's phone blared to life. Someone had finally answered her frantic calls. She put it on speaker, her voice rising with desperate triumph. Yes, Governor's office. This is Barbara Reynolds of Oakridge Estates. We have an emergency situation involving corrupt officials and private property abuse. The tired voice on the other end cut through her rant. Ma'am, this is the Governor's public information line. We cannot intervene in local property disputes. Please contact your municipal authorities. Barbara hurled her phone at the ground, shattering it. There, all in on it, every one of them. She began wrapping more caution tape around the decorative posts marking my driveway entrance, creating a bizarre yellow web. Officer Thompson spoke into his radio, requesting backup. Ms. Reynolds, this is your final warning. Remove the tape and leave the property or you will be arrested. Patricia Wells emerged from her SUV, phone in hand. I've just spoken with the full HOA board. We're filing for an emergency injunction to bar Barbara from all community properties pending a formal hearing. The news crew had stopped filming and started packing up, apparently deciding this was no longer the civil rights story Barbara had promised. Their departure seemed to trigger something in her. She rushed to her garage and emerged with cans of red spray paint. If you won't protect this community, I'll do it myself, she shouted, advancing toward my private road with clear intent. I'll mark every safety violation. Everyone will see the truth. Officer Thompson moved to intercept her, but Barbara darted around him with surprising agility. She managed to spray a large red X on my private road before officers could reach her. This road is a hazard, a violation, a threat to public safety. James Martinez documented everything, while Gregory Walsh shook his head in disbelief. I have never seen an HOA dispute escalate to this level of criminal behavior, Walsh muttered. The board's liability insurance won't cover any of this. Dave and Laura Mitchell watched from their driveway, recording on their phones as Barbara continued her paint-wielding rampage. She's actually lost it, Dave commented quietly. All this over a private road she has no claim to. Barbara's voice rose to a fever pitch as she sprayed more red marks across the pavement. You all think you can silence me. I've protected this community for years. I've maintained standards. I've kept the riffraff out. She spun toward a gathering crowd, paint can raised. And this is how you repay me. Additional police cruisers arrived, lights flashing. The sight of reinforcements seemed to push Barbara over the edge. She hurled the paint can aside and rushed to her garage again, emerging with what appeared to be a garden hose. Ms. Reynolds, Officer Thompson's voice carried a clear warning. Step away from the garage and keep your hands where we can see them. But Barbara was beyond hearing. She dragged the hose toward my private road, connecting it to her outdoor spigot. If you won't close this road properly, I'll make it unusable. Let's see how safe it is when it's flooded. Officers moved in as Barbara turned the water on full blast, attempting to flood my private road. She fought their efforts to restrain her, screaming about property values and community standards, while the hose writhed like a garden snake, spraying water in all directions. Linda Stewart finally emerged from her house, phone raised to record. But even she seemed shocked by her friend's behavior. Barbara, stop! This isn't helping anymore! The scene descended into chaos as Barbara broke free from the officers, running toward my workshop with clear, destructive intent. Her heels clicked on the wet pavement as she searched for more ways to damage my property. James Martinez approached me quietly. This is beyond HOA disputes or civil matters now. She's actively attempting to destroy private property while resisting law enforcement. The criminal charges will be significant. Patricia Wells watched with a mix of horror and Resignation. To think this all started because she couldn't accept that one road wasn't under her control. Years of community service and reputation destroyed in a matter of weeks. Barbara's voice carried across the neighborhood as officers finally managed to restrain her. "You're all blind. Can't you see what's happening to our community? The standards are slipping. The values are dropping. It's all falling apart." Officer Thompson read Barbara her rights while she continued to rant about community standards and safety violations. Linda Stewart filmed everything, though her hands shook noticeably. The remaining spectators watched in stunned silence as Barbara Reynolds, self-appointed guardian of Oakridge Estates, was led to a patrol car in handcuffs. Gregory Walsh turned to the HOA board members present. "I suggest an emergency meeting to discuss the implications of today's events. The association's liability exposure is significant." James documented the damage: red paint marring my private road, water damage from Barbara's flooding attempt, torn caution tape fluttering in the breeze. Each act of vandalism added to the growing list of criminal charges. As Barbara was placed in the patrol car, her voice carried a final, almost prophetic warning: "You'll see. Without proper oversight, this whole community will collapse. You need me. You all need me." The patrol car drove away, leaving a stunned neighborhood in its wake. Water still trickled down my private road, mixing with red paint to create pale, pink rivers. Linda Stewart stood alone in her driveway, phone lowered, looking lost without her friend and co-conspirator. Patricia Wells surveyed the damage with a heavy sigh. "We'll need to completely revise our HOA governance structure after this. No single board member should ever have this much perceived authority again." The setting sun cast long shadows across the scene of Barbara's final stand. Neighbors slowly dispersed, phones full of footage that would undoubtedly circulate through community social media for weeks to come. The quiet suburban peace of Oakridge Estates had been shattered, perhaps permanently. Dave Mitchell helped me clean up the worst of the paint and water damage, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know what's crazy? She could have just accepted that one road wasn't under her control. All of this because she couldn't handle not having power over every inch of the neighborhood." As night fell, emergency board meetings were convened, insurance adjusters were contacted, and statements were collected. Barbara Reynolds' reign as unofficial enforcer of Oakridge Estates had ended in spectacular fashion, but the repercussions of her actions would continue to ripple through the community. Morning arrived with an eerie quiet settling over Oakridge Estates. The police tape marking Barbara Reynolds' house as a crime scene fluttered in the early breeze, a stark reminder of yesterday's events. A small group of insurance adjusters gathered near my private road, documenting the paint damage and taking photographs of water-stained pavement. Richard Cooper pulled into my driveway, clutching a thick folder of incident reports. "The HOA's insurance company needs your statement about the property damage," he explained, looking haggard. "They're also requesting copies of your security footage for their investigation." Through my kitchen window, I watched Linda Stewart emerge from her house, no camera in sight for the first time in weeks. She stood in her driveway for several minutes, staring at Barbara's empty house before retreating inside. The absence of her constant surveillance felt oddly disconcerting. James Martinez arrived with news from the courthouse. Barbara's being held pending a psychiatric evaluation. The district attorney is considering multiple criminal charges: vandalism, filing false reports, forgery of official documents, resisting arrest. The list keeps growing as they review the evidence. A cleaning crew worked methodically to remove the red paint from my private road, their efforts drawing curious glances from passing neighbors. The water damage had left subtle stains that might take weeks to fade, permanent reminders of Barbara's final meltdown. Patricia Wells called an emergency community meeting at the Oakridge Estates clubhouse. The parking lot filled quickly as Residents arrived, many whom I'd never seen at HOA meetings before. The events of yesterday had shaken the entire neighborhood out of its usual apathy. Inside the clubhouse, Gregory Walsh stood at the podium, outlining the legal ramifications of Barbara's actions. The association's insurance will cover the property damage, but we're facing potential liability issues from her fraudulent use of HOA letterhead and false claims of official authority. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Walsh detailed Barbara's extensive campaign of deception. She had apparently been forging HOA documents for months, creating fictional committees and inventing authority she never possessed. The scope of her fraud was still being uncovered. Dave Mitchell raised his hand. What about all those city permits and work orders she filed? Who's responsible for sorting that mess out? Walsh sighed heavily. We've got a team working with various city departments to identify and revoke all fraudulent permits. Ms. Reynolds was remarkably thorough in spreading her false claims across multiple agencies. The meeting turned to discussion of HOA reform. Patricia Wells proposed new oversight measures to prevent any single board member from accumulating too much power. We need better checks and balances, she emphasized. What happened here can never be allowed to happen again. A representative from the City Planning Commission arrived midway through the meeting, carrying folders of Barbara's fraudulent applications. We're still finding new ones, he reported wearily. She filed appeals under multiple names, created fake property surveys, even forged signatures of city officials. The scale of Barbara's deception stunned the room into silence. She had apparently spent weeks laying groundwork for her campaign to claim my private road, filing dozens of false documents with various authorities. Her attention to detail in creating this web of lies was almost admirable in a disturbing way. James Martinez reviewed the growing stack of evidence. She must have spent hours creating these forgeries. The level of planning suggests this was more than just a spontaneous power grab. She had been preparing for this kind of confrontation for a long time. Linda Stewart arrived late to the meeting, slipping into a back seat. Without Barbara beside her, she seemed smaller somehow, less certain. Several neighbors who had previously supported Barbara's campaign now pointedly avoided looking in Linda's direction. The afternoon brought more revelations. A city clerk arrived with records showing Barbara had attempted to file paperwork, claiming authority over other private properties in the area. My private road wasn't her first target, just the first time someone had stood firm against her tactics. Mark Wilson, the surveyor, confirmed that Barbara had tried to bribe him to alter his property line findings. She offered to pay triple my usual rate if I'd adjust the boundaries to show the road as common property, he reported. When I refused, she threatened to have my surveying license reviewed. Officer Thompson stopped by to collect additional statements, bringing news from the police station. Ms. Reynolds had quite a collection of forged documents in her home office. She'd been practicing official signatures, creating fake letterhead, even making her own official-looking stamps and seals. The HOA board convened a special session to formally remove Barbara from her position and begin damage control. Patricia Wells looked exhausted as she signed the necessary paperwork. We should have seen the warning signs, she admitted. The constant complaints, the unofficial committees, the way she pressured people into compliance through intimidation rather than proper channels. Gregory Walsh spent hours on conference calls with insurance adjusters and legal teams, trying to untangle the web of liability issues Barbara had created. The association's exposure could be significant, he warned. She used her board position to lend credibility to her fraudulent actions. As evening approached, a moving truck appeared outside Barbara's house. Her adult daughter emerged from a sleek SUV, clearly unhappy about having to handle her mother's affairs. She avoided eye contact with neighbors as she supervised the removal of essential items from the house. James Martinez observed the scene thoughtfully. The daughter's presence suggests Barbara won't be returning home anytime soon. Given the extent of her actions and her mental state during arrest, she's likely facing both criminal charges and mandatory psychiatric treatment. Linda Stewart watched the moving truck from her front window, phone in hand but not recording. The partnership she had formed with Barbara in harassing me seemed to have lost its appeal in light of recent events. The setting sun cast long shadows across my private road, now mostly cleaned of Barbara's vandalism, but still bearing subtle reminders of her final meltdown. Insurance adjusters had marked areas needing resurfacing, each spot a testament to how thoroughly one person's obsession with control had disrupted our quiet community. Dave and Laura Mitchell invited me over for dinner, a gesture of neighborly support after weeks of tension. "The whole thing seems unreal," Laura commented as we sat on their patio. "How someone could become so fixated on controlling a private road that they'd destroy their own life over it." As night fell, the usual peace of Oakridge Estates began to return, though changed somehow. Barbara's campaign of harassment had revealed vulnerabilities in our community structure and forced everyone to examine how one person had been allowed to accumulate so much unofficial power. Patricia Wells called one final time before heading home. "The board will be implementing new policies immediately," she assured me. "No more unofficial committees, no individual members acting without oversight, no harassment campaigns disguised as community advocacy." The stars emerged over a neighborhood forever changed by one woman's inability to accept limitations on her authority. Barbara Reynolds had sought total control and ended up losing everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and the community she had claimed to protect. James Martinez left me with a thick folder of documentation for upcoming legal proceedings. "Document everything," he advised. "This case will likely be cited in HOA governance discussions for years to come." Through my security cameras, I watched the last light go out in Barbara's house as her daughter locked up and drove away. The empty house stood as a monument to the consequences of unchecked authority and obsessive control. The night settled into unusual quiet. No late-night documentation walks, no unauthorized photography, no whispered conversations about community standards. Oakridge Estates was learning to exist without Barbara Reynolds' constant oversight, and somehow the community would be stronger for it. Sunrise illuminated a neighborhood in transition. Professional cleaners worked diligently to remove the last traces of spray paint from my private road, while city workers dismantled the remaining makeshift barriers Barbara had attempted to install. The morning carried an air of renewal, as if Oakridge Estates was slowly awakening from a collective nightmare. A knock at my door revealed Gregory Walsh, looking unusually disheveled. "The district attorney wants to meet," he announced without preamble. "They're considering upgrading some charges after reviewing your security footage. The premeditation evident in Barbara's actions changes things significantly." Richard Cooper arrived moments later, carrying coffee and a stack of newspapers. Local media had picked up the story, with headlines ranging from HOA gone wild to suburban power struggle leads to criminal charges. The coverage painted a surreal picture of our quiet community. Through my kitchen window, I watched Linda Stewart methodically removing her elaborate surveillance setup. The tripods and cameras that had monitored my every move for weeks were being packed away in careful silence. She worked with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact with passing neighbors. James Martinez called with updates from the courthouse. "Barbara's psychiatric evaluation has been extended. The evaluators are concerned about her disconnect from reality, especially regarding her perceived authority in the community. They're recommending comprehensive treatment before any court proceedings." A town car pulled up to Barbara's house, and a well-dressed woman emerged, carrying a briefcase. "That's Catherine Reynolds, Barbara's sister," Dave Mitchell informed me as he walked over. "Word is she's trying to get power of attorney to handle Barbara's affairs. The daughter's heading back to California." Catherine's presence drew curious onlookers. She moved with Barbara's same authoritative stride, but carried herself with genuine, rather than assumed, authority. Several neighbors approached her, likely seeking information about Barbara's condition. Patricia Wells called an informal gathering at her home to discuss community healing. The living room filled with residents eager to process recent events. Many shared stories of past encounters with Barbara, revealing a pattern of intimidation that had gone unchecked for years. "She threatened to report my garden gnomes as hazardous obstacles," Mrs. Parker recalled, shaking her head. "Said they could cause accidents if someone had to swerve onto my lawn in an emergency. I actually believed her and removed them." Similar stories emerged throughout the afternoon. Barbara had constructed an elaborate web of fictional rules and regulations, enforcing them through a combination of confident assertion and relentless pressure. The community was only now realizing how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. Gregory Walsh returned from the district attorney's office looking grave. They found evidence of similar behavior in Barbara's previous neighborhood. She left under similar circumstances, escalating conflicts over property rights, fraudulent documents, attempts to claim control over private property. This revelation stunned the gathering. Barbara's campaign against my private road wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern. She had apparently moved from community to community, establishing herself as an authority figure before attempting to expand her control through intimidation and fraud. Linda Stewart arrived late to Patricia's gathering, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. The room fell silent as she entered. After a moment's hesitation, she spoke. "I owe everyone an apology, especially Michael. I let Barbara convince me we were protecting the community. I never questioned whether she actually had the authority she claimed." Her admission broke some of the tension. Other neighbors began acknowledging their own roles in enabling Barbara's behavior. The conversation shifted from shock and anger to reflection and responsibility. James Martinez arrived with more documentation for upcoming legal proceedings. "The DA is particularly interested in the pattern of escalation," he explained. "The progression from harassment to fraud to vandalism shows a clear deterioration of judgment and increasing desperation to maintain control." Catherine Reynolds approached me as I was leaving Patricia's house. "I want to apologize for my sister's actions," she said quietly. "Barbara has always struggled with control issues, but we never imagined it would go this far. Our family will make full restitution for any damages." The afternoon brought more revelations as residents began examining records of Barbara's tenure on the HOA board. She had gradually accumulated unofficial authority through a combination of volunteer work and assumed responsibility. Few had questioned her self-appointed positions or growing influence. A city official arrived to inspect the removed barriers and signs, documenting everything for the criminal case. "The level of preparation is remarkable," he noted. "She had created a complete paper trail of fictional authorizations and approvals. If you hadn't stood your ground, she might have succeeded in taking control of your private road." Richard Cooper spent hours revising HOA documentation to prevent future abuse of authority. "We're implementing strict verification procedures for all official communications," he explained. "No more unofficial committees or self-appointed positions of authority." The cleaning crew finished their work on my private road, erasing the last visible signs of Barbara's meltdown. The pavement looked almost new, though subtle water stains remained as a reminder of how quickly order could descend into chaos. Linda Stewart appeared at my door late in the afternoon, carrying a portable hard drive. "All the surveillance footage," she explained hesitantly. I should have questioned why we were documenting everything, but Barbara made it seem so necessary. She had an explanation for everything. As evening approached, Catherine Reynolds supervised more packing at Barbara's house. Through my security cameras, I watched her methodically boxing up the remnants of her sister's carefully constructed facade of authority. Files full of fraudulent documents, supplies for creating official-looking papers, even a collection of fake stamps and seals. James Martinez called one final time before heading home. The DA is reviewing similar cases from other jurisdictions. Apparently, this type of behavior, individuals attempting to seize control of private property through fraudulent HOA authority, is more common than people realize. Your case might set some important precedents. The sunset painted Oakridge Estates in gentle colors, softening the lingering signs of recent turmoil. Neighbors gathered in small groups on porches and driveways, sharing stories and processing events. The community was different now, more aware of the importance of questioning authority and verifying claims. Patricia Wells ended the day with a final community email outlining new procedures for HOA governance. "We're implementing strict oversight measures," she wrote. "No single individual will ever again be allowed to accumulate unofficial authority or enforce imaginary rules." As night fell, I stood on my private road, now clean of Barbara's attempts to mark it as community property. The pavement seemed to shine in the streetlights, a testament to resilience and the importance of standing firm against unauthorized control. Catherine Reynolds' town car pulled away from Barbara's house for the last time, carrying boxes of evidence for the ongoing investigation. The empty house stood dark and quiet, its former occupant facing consequences she never imagined when she first decided to challenge my property rights. The night settled over a changed community, one more aware of the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of maintaining clear boundaries. Oakridge Estates had learned valuable lessons about power, control, and the courage to stand up to those who would abuse their position. The district attorney's office buzzed with activity as James Martinez guided me through security. Today marked the formal filing of charges against Barbara Reynolds, and the gravity of the situation reflected in the faces of everyone involved. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen waited in a conference room surrounded by towering stacks of evidence collected from Barbara's house. "The scope of the fraud is staggering," Chen explained, gesturing to the documents. "We've uncovered similar patterns in 3 other communities." Ms. Reynolds appears to have developed a systematic approach to infiltrating HOA boards and attempting to seize control of private property through fraudulent means. Security footage from my cameras played silently on a wall-mounted screen, showing Barbara's escalating behavior. Chen paused the playback on a particularly telling moment. Barbara directing the concrete truck toward my private road while waving falsified work orders. "The premeditation is clear," Chen noted, pulling out a timeline. She began laying groundwork months before making her first move, creating fraudulent documents and establishing herself as an authority figure. The psychological evaluation suggests this behavior stems from a deep-seated need for control, combined with an inability to recognize legitimate boundaries. Richard Cooper arrived with additional files from the HOA's archives. A forensic accountant had discovered Barbara had been maintaining 2 sets of committee records, the official ones filed with the board and her own elaborate fictional version, supporting her claims of authority. She created an entire parallel governance structure, the accountant explained, spreading papers across the conference table. Fictional committees, unauthorized regulations, elaborate enforcement procedures, all designed to support her gradual acquisition of control over private property. Outside the district attorney's office, a small group of reporters gathered. Barbara's case had attracted attention from media outlets specializing in property rights and HOA disputes. Several recognized legal experts had already published analyses of the situation, citing it as a prime example of HOA authority abuse. A representative from the state HOA Oversight Committee arrived to review the evidence. "We're seeing an increasing number of similar cases," she reported. "Individuals using HOA positions to attempt unauthorized property acquisition. But Ms. Reynolds' case is unique in its scope and sophistication." James Martinez methodically organized our documentation while Chen prepared the formal charges. Each fraudulent document, every false permit, all the forged signatures would be presented as evidence of a calculated campaign to seize control of private property through deception and intimidation. Back in Oakridge Estates, Catherine Reynolds supervised another wave of packing at Barbara's house. Professional organizers sorted through years of accumulated HOA documents, separating legitimate papers from Barbara's extensive collection of forgeries. Linda Stewart emerged from her house, carrying more surveillance equipment to her car. The trunk was already filled with cameras, tripods, and recording devices, tools of her partnership with Barbara in documenting imagined violations. "I never questioned why we needed so much documentation," Linda admitted quietly as I passed her driveway. "Barbara always had a reason, a regulation, a community standard that justified everything. It seemed so reasonable at the time." Patricia. Wells called an emergency board session to address the growing media attention. Gregory Walsh advised on legal strategies, while Richard Cooper outlined new governance procedures designed to prevent future abuse of authority. "We need absolute transparency," Patricia emphasized, addressing the gathered board members. "Every committee must have clear oversight. All enforcement actions must be properly documented, and no individual member can act unilaterally." Dave Mitchell arrived with news from his contacts at City Hall. Municipal authorities had completed their review of all permits and work orders submitted under Barbara's name, uncovering dozens of fraudulent documents spanning several departments. "She had a systematic approach," Dave explained, showing me the findings. "Start with small, seemingly legitimate requests. Establish a pattern of official interaction, then gradually escalate to more significant demands." Most staff never questioned her authority because she had created such an elaborate facade of legitimacy. The afternoon brought more revelations as Catherine Reynolds discovered a hidden file cabinet in Barbara's garage. Inside, meticulously organized folders revealed years of surveillance notes on various properties she had targeted for acquisition through HOA manipulation. James Martinez photographed everything for evidence, while Chen added new charges to the growing list. Barbara's systematic approach to undermining property rights through fraudulent HOA authority would likely result in additional criminal counts. A process server delivered thick envelopes to homes throughout Oakridge Estates, subpoenas for residents to testify about their experiences with Barbara's unauthorized enforcement actions. The district attorney's office wanted to establish a clear pattern of intimidation and control. Linda Stewart sat in her car for nearly an hour, staring at Barbara's empty house before finally driving away. Her role in enabling Barbara's behavior would require careful examination during the legal proceedings, though Chen had indicated she might receive consideration for cooperating with the investigation. Gregory Walsh spent the afternoon reviewing insurance claims related to Barbara's actions. The HOA's liability coverage would be tested by the scope of her unauthorized activities and the damage caused during her final confrontation. The insurance companies are particularly interested in the pattern of escalation, Walsh explained. They want to understand how someone could accumulate so much unofficial authority without triggering oversight mechanisms. As evening approached, Catherine Reynolds made a surprising discovery. a detailed journal chronicling Barbara's strategies for establishing control in various communities. The entries revealed a calculated approach to identifying vulnerable properties and creating fictional regulations to justify acquisition attempts. Chen immediately dispatched investigators to collect the journal. "This could help us understand similar cases," she noted. "The psychology behind these attempts to seize private property through HOA manipulation is still poorly understood." Patricia Wells organized a community meeting to discuss the ongoing legal proceedings and their implications for Oakridge Estates. The clubhouse filled with residents eager to understand how their quiet community had become ground zero for a landmark HOA abuse case. "We're implementing comprehensive reforms," Patricia assured the gathered neighbors. "New oversight procedures, clear documentation requirements, regular audits of all enforcement actions. What happened here will serve as a warning to other communities about the dangers of unchecked authority." James Martinez provided updates on the criminal case's progress. Barbara's psychiatric evaluation had been extended as doctors attempted to understand the complex motivations behind her elaborate schemes to control private property through fraudulent means. The setting sun cast long shadows across my private road, now restored to its original condition, but forever marked by the memory of Barbara's desperate attempt to claim it as community property. Each passing car seemed to slow slightly. Residents, still processing how their neighborhood had become the center of a legal battle over HOA authority limits. Catherine Reynolds made one final visit to my house before leaving town. "The family will make full restitution," she promised. "But more importantly, we want to understand how Barbara developed these behaviors. Perhaps by studying what happened here, we can prevent similar situations in other communities." As night fell, the quiet streets of Oakridge Estates reflected a community forever changed by one person's obsession with control. The lessons learned would ripple through HOA governance discussions nationwide, a reminder of the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between individual rights and community oversight. The stars emerged over a neighborhood still grappling with the aftermath of Barbara's actions, but also stronger for having confronted and overcome the challenge to private property rights. Oakridge Estates had become an unwitting laboratory for studying HOA authority abuse, and its response would help shape future discussions about community governance and individual rights. The courthouse steps swarmed with reporters as James Martinez guided me through the crowd. Today marked the final hearing in Barbara Reynolds' case, the culmination of months of legal proceedings and psychiatric evaluations. The gallery filled quickly with Oakridge Estates residents, legal observers, and representatives from HOA governance organizations across the state. Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen stood at the prosecution table, surrounded by evidence boxes containing the physical remnants of Barbara's elaborate scheme. The defense table remained empty as we waited for Barbara's court-appointed attorney and her sister Catherine to arrive. Linda Stewart slipped into a back row, her usual recording equipment conspicuously absent. She had provided key testimony about Barbara's systematic approach to property acquisition attempts, earning consideration in exchange for her cooperation with the investigation. Judge Eleanor Martinez entered the courtroom, her expression grave. As she reviewed the final psychiatric evaluation, Barbara's appearance in court had been delayed multiple times as doctors worked to address her disconnection from reality and obsession with community control. Barbara entered flanked by deputies, her previously immaculate appearance now subdued. Catherine Reynolds followed close behind with their attorney, carrying a thick folder of medical documentation. The transformation in Barbara's demeanor was striking. Gone was the commanding presence that had terrorized Oakridge Estates. Chen presented the prosecution's final summary, methodically outlining the pattern of fraud, harassment, and attempted property seizure. Security footage from my cameras played silently on courtroom screens, showing Barbara's progression from intimidation to outright criminal behavior. Your Honor, Chen concluded, Ms. Reynolds's actions represent a calculated campaign to subvert property rights through abuse of HOA authority. The evidence demonstrates clear premeditation and escalating disregard for legal boundaries. Barbara's attorney emphasized her client's psychiatric condition and willingness to accept treatment. Medical experts testified about the complex intersection of personality disorders and power dynamics that had driven her behavior. Catherine Reynolds addressed the court, expressing her family's commitment to making restitution. We recognize the damage Barbara's actions caused to both individuals and the community. We're establishing a fund to cover all damages and implementing safeguards to prevent any future incidents. Property rights experts testified about the broader implications of the case, citing it as a landmark example of HOA authority abuse. Their analysis would help shape new regulations governing community associations and individual property rights. Patricia Wells presented documentation of Oakridge Estates governance reforms, highlighting new oversight measures designed to prevent future abuse of authority. The HOA's response to Barbara's actions would serve as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. Judge Martinez reviewed all evidence before delivering her ruling. Barbara would receive a combination of supervised treatment and restricted community access, with strict monitoring of any future involvement in property management or HOA activities. The courtroom emptied slowly as neighbors processed the outcome. Dave and Laura Mitchell offered quiet support as reporters sought comments about the community's response to the verdict. Gregory Walsh handled media inquiries, while James Martinez secured copies of all final documentation. Outside, autumn leaves scattered across the courthouse steps as Catherine Reynolds made a final statement to the press. Her measured words emphasized accountability and healing, acknowledging the damage while focusing on prevention and reform. Linda Stewart approached me hesitantly as the crowd dispersed. I've been thinking about selling my house, she admitted, quietly. Too many memories. Too much responsibility for enabling Barbara's behavior. The community needs fresh starts all around. Back in Oakridge Estates, the afternoon sun illuminated a neighborhood transformed by months of legal proceedings and collective reflection. My private road stood as a symbol of resistance to unauthorized control, its quiet presence a reminder of the importance of maintaining clear boundaries. Patricia Wells convened a final community meeting to discuss implementation of new HOA governance procedures. The gathered residents demonstrated renewed commitment to protecting individual rights while maintaining appropriate community standards. Richard Cooper presented updated documentation reflecting comprehensive reforms. Each new measure addressed specific aspects of Barbara's methods, creating multiple layers of oversight to prevent future abuse of authority. James Martinez provided copies of the court's ruling for HOA records, emphasizing key findings that would influence future property rights cases. Barbara Reynolds' attempt to seize control of my private road had established important legal precedents. The setting sun cast long shadows across quiet streets as neighbors gathered in small groups, sharing reactions to the verdict and hopes for community healing. Oakridge Estates had emerged stronger from its confrontation with unchecked authority, its residents more aware and engaged. Catherine Reynolds supervised final preparations at Barbara's house, now sold to a young family eager to join our reformed community. The property that had once served as headquarters for Barbara's campaign of control would soon welcome residents committed to proper boundaries. Linda Stewart's "For Sale" sign appeared at dusk, marking another change in neighborhood dynamics. Her role in enabling Barbara's behavior had led to deep reflection about community responsibility and the importance of questioning authority. Dave Mitchell helped me install new security cameras, though their purpose now focused on routine property protection rather than documenting harassment. The equipment that had captured Barbara's downfall would serve more conventional purposes. Gregory Walsh delivered final insurance settlement documents as evening approached. The financial costs of Barbara's actions had been substantial, but the true impact lay in transformed community awareness and engagement. Patricia Wells made a final pass through the neighborhood, ensuring all traces of Barbara's unauthorized signs and markers had been removed. Oakridge Estates had reclaimed its identity as a community based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. Night fell over streets now free from late-night documentation walks and unauthorized surveillance. The quiet darkness reflected a neighborhood at peace with itself, its residents secure in their private property rights and community responsibilities. James Martinez closed our final meeting with words that would resonate beyond Oakridge Estates. This case reminds us that community standards must never override individual rights, and authority without oversight inevitably leads to abuse. The stars emerged over a neighborhood forever changed by its encounter with unchecked power, but stronger for having confronted and overcome the challenge. Barbara Reynolds' attempt to claim my private road had instead claimed her own freedom, leaving behind lessons that would influence HOA governance for years to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.